Hello everyone, welcome to Learn ReactJS for Frontend Development by CodeChef. In today's lesson, we'll be going through two practical concepts which you will come across when working with React applications. First, we'll be looking at a range utility function which allows us to generate sequences of numbers, which makes rendering repeated elements in JSX much cleaner. Then, we'll be looking at component styling using CSS Modules, a simple and scalable way to control component level styles. So let's begin. So let us first understand about range utility. It helps us generate sequences of numbers which become extremely useful when working with React and JSX. So why do we need a range? In JavaScript, we normally use loops like for to repeat actions. But in React, JSX does not allow us to write loops directly. So instead, we generate an array first and then loop over it using map method. That's where a range utility becomes helpful. So what does a range do? A range utility simply creates an array of numbers for us. For example, instead of manually writing numbers, it can generate an array like 0 to 4 automatically. Now let us look at the range function parameters. The range function works using three parameters. Start is where the sequence begins and by default is 0. End decides where the sequence stops, but this value is not included. Step controls how much the number increases each time and it defaults to 1. So let's break down the code here. First we create an empty array called output. If only one value is passed, we treat it as the end value and start counting from 0. Then we run a loop, push each number into the array and then finally return the new array. This gives us a flexible utility that works in multiple scenarios. So let's look at some range examples. Calling range 5 creates numbers from 0 to 4. Range 2, 6 starts from 2 and ends at 5. And when we use a step value like range 1, 10, 2, it skips numbers and generates only odd values. In React, we combine the range function with the map method to generate components dynamically. This approach avoids repetitive JSX and keeps our code clean and readable. It's a very common pattern in real-world React applications. As applications grow, managing styles becomes challenging. Using global CSS can cause conflicts where styles are accidentally affecting other components. This is why React developers prefer scoped styling solutions. CSS Modules solve this problem by scoping styles to individual components. Each component gets its own styles and class name collisions are completely avoided. So in this example, we create a card component using CSS Modules. When we import a CSS file, React gives us a style object. This ensures the styles apply only to this component and nowhere else. CSS modules work especially well for reusable components like buttons. We can safely reuse the button across the app without worrying about style conflicts. So let us walk through this code step by step and understand how everything connects. That is, how we can use a range utility in a function. At the top, we define a function called range. This function helps us generate an array of numbers instead of writing loops manually. The function takes three parameters: start, end, and step. The step has a default value of 1, which means numbers increase by 1 unless we change it. Inside the function, we create an empty array called result. This array will store the numbers we generate. Next, we check if end is undefined. This happens when we call range with only one argument like range 3. In that case, we treat the single value as the end and start counting from 0. So range 3 becomes 0, 1 and 2. Then, we use a for loop to generate numbers starting from start and stopping before end. On each iteration, we push the current number into the result array. Finally, we return the result array. Now let's look at the number boxes component. This component receives a prop called count. Inside the JSX, we call range count, and if count is 3, this gives us an array 0, 1, 2. Then, we use the map method on this array. And for each number in the array, we return a li tag element. Inside each item, we display num plus 1. This is because our range starts from 0, but we want to show numbers starting from 1 in the UI. Finally, in the app component, we render number boxes and pass count as 3. This means the range function generates 3 values and React renders 3 list items. So instead of manually writing multiple li tagged elements, we generate them dynamically using data. So let's just run this code once. So you can see we printed out the numbers 1, 2 and 3. Let's just submit this code once. So we passed both the test cases. Let us now understand how this notification component is styled using CSS modules in React. At the top, we import styles from notification.module.css. Because this file uses the .module.css naming convention, React treats it as a CSS module. This means all the class names inside the file are scoped only to this component and won't affect any other part of this application. Next, we define a component called notification. This component receives a prop called message. Inside the JSX, we return a div. Instead of using a normal class name string, we use class name equal to styles.notification. Here, styles.notification refers to a uniquely generated class name created by CSS modules. Even though we write .notification in CSS, React converts it into a safe scoped class behind the scenes. Inside the div, we simply display the message passed as a prop. In the app component, we render the notification component twice. Each time, we pass a different message. This shows how the same style component can be reused with different content without duplicating code or styles. Now coming to the CSS file itself, the .notification class sets a green background color, white text, padding, rounded corners and vertical spacing. The hover rule slightly darkens the background color when the user hovers over the notification. Even though the class names look simple, it is safely scoped to this component only. Now why does this approach matter? Using CSS modules helps you keep styles predictable and maintainable as your application grows. Each component owns its styles, which avoids accidental overrides and styling bugs. Let's just run this code once. So you can see we have rendered two different components with the same styling. Let's just submit this code once. So as you can see, we passed all three test cases.
So that's how we use a range utility function and control component level styles in React. To really understand this concept, make sure to head over to the CodeChef platform and try out the practice problems yourself. That's where the real learning happens. That was it for this lesson and I will see you in the next one. Thank you.